While perhaps not terribly important to the Japanese who were making the shows, the foreign markets always were looking for ways to make money without creating anything original. After all, if they could make a few snips here and there in the editing room and make their investment back, why worry about the integrity of the series? Of course, this was the 80s and all TV execs were doing cocaine like most people use their lungs, so whatever it took to make a buck was A-OK. Which is why our subject in our episode today is well known in the United States, but to its home country, it was just another robot show. Before we get to that, Tatsunoko dipped its toes gently into the robot genre again, but this time it was with Golden Warrior Gold Lightan. It was a sentient robot which mostly discounts it from our history, but like Astro Ganger before him, it bears a nod. After that was Beast King GoLion, the robot who would be Voltron. GoLion took place on Altea, a distant planet, as a group of rebels fought against the Galra Empire. It seems pretty stock standard, but this is where it's important to remember that, in spite of our vast knowledge base of mecha anime, this was the first time anything like it had ever really made a splash on American shores. Sadly, it was never shown on American TV in its original uncut form, because in spite of the fact that no one was paying attention to children's programming in the 1980s, everyone was paying attention to children's programming in the 1980s. Most of the deaths and violence were trimmed or cut entirely, and they wiped the series clean of everything short of reanimating it. And even then, the 52 episodes weren't sufficient, so they commissioned another plot arc, even though the quality was a bit lower than the original series. The reason for this was simple. Syndication was key for American markets, and while it wasn't necessary to get the usual 100-episode count for children's programming, 52 episodes wouldn't cut it either. So while they could have only made 65 episodes, they went a little further and made 72 in total. This sweetened the deal even further for syndication and made it an almost entirely American piece of work. In fairness to its creators, they lacked access to the original story translations and had to do it all from square one. But for the Japanese, it was just another Monster of the Week show. To this day, there still hasn't been a Japanese DVD release of the original series. At what point does a parody become just the thing it's poking fun at? Right up next was the giant robot's play on itself, GoShogun. Ashi Production looked at the giant robot series of the time and said, "You know what? This whole thing is kind of silly, ain't it?" And with fairness, it was. So when GoShogun went into production, there was definitely a non-serious vibe to it. When the main attack of your robot is to fire concentrated ennui at your robot enemy and make them shrug themselves to death, maybe serious is not the order of the day. And then the sequel movie came out and went all dark and broody, and while it was a fine film, it was very much at odds with the show in general. For something that was silly and fun, why go so far in the other direction? And in spite of all that, the series was the first foray into being overtly silly, and succeeded fairly well. In the tradition of Combattler V's series, the next on the list is responsible for starting the J9 series. Galaxy Cyclone Braiger was set in the far future, where humanity has colonized the solar system, and one of the colonists wants to make a new star out of Jupiter. This is, of course, a big problem for Earth, and so they send out Braiger to go take care of business. It was a little dark in tone, but what it's really famous for is having the first TV anime sex scene. Take that how you will. However dark Braiger and his successors may have been, God Mars took it one step further. If Combattler V was the first series to really make a go of character development in the Super Robot show, God Mars was a bit of a logical conclusion. It dispensed with any silliness and just told a good story with a surprising amount of violence and a constant sense of danger. It's one of the better shows of the 80s, but it focused specifically on just being a good show.
And sometimes that's enough.
Finally, the top robot anime of 1981 was Fang of the Sun Dougram. In spite of an outwardly super robot sounding name, the series was quite heavily in the real robot genre and focused specifically on military tactics. This was a smashing success in spite of its somewhat plodding pace, but the strength of the mecha designs and the almost weirdly primitive look to the characters in the machine seeded it as a proud successor to Gundam. Real robots got the green light, and the genre was set to launch, and Dougram would lead to 1983's Armored Troopers Votom. The next few years weren't nearly as lousy with robot shows as years prior, but they didn't need to be. The most important shows had their groundwork laid, and it would be here that super robots began to fade into the background while real robots got their time to shine. And in 1982, they blasted off with aplomb.
貫いて地球を撃ったイカズチは我ら幼い人類に目覚めてくれと放たれた。